So welcome back to obviously Fight Talk. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see, and if you're listening on audio, sure, I'm not going to tell you. We are now joined by MMA Fighting and The Ringer. We're going to be doing the big stories in MMA this week with Chuck Mindenhall. So Chuck, thanks again for coming on to obviously Fight Talk, my man.
Oh, thanks for having me, fellas. Always fun.
Cheers. Chuck, there's no prizes for guessing what we're going to be talking about. First here, the big news with Conor McGregor, where he jumps the cage at Bellator 187. To set the scene briefly, his teammate Charlie Ward was fighting against John Redmond in a competitive first round fight, and with a second to go on the clock, Charlie Ward landed a big left, I think it was left hook,
yes,
that put John Redmond down, landed a couple of shots on the ground as well, and Mark Goddard stepped in. The confusion arose because up over the cage came Conor McGregor jumping into the arms of Charlie Ward, who landed a solid takedown, it must be said. And then Mark Goddard tried to separate to sort of say the fight's not over. And then all confusion broke out in the madness. So let's talk about that. So me and Robert, we were covering it, Chuck. We were there. We were live in the 3 Arena. And then I just said to Robert, this wasn't live in the States. Yeah. It wasn't televised. It wasn't... So how did this news come about to you? How did this land on your doorstep? And were you like, what the...
Well, you know, man, this is one of those weird ones because at MMA Fighting, we have like a group email that we all kind of, hop on and communicate through. And somebody had posted the footage but it was pretty bad angle. So you couldn't really understand what was going on. I think a lot of us assumed at the time that, that Charlie had lost. Yeah. And that there was something had happened in the aftermath of that. So it wasn't really clear, but very shortly thereafter, somebody came through with a different angle where you could actually see what was going on. And then it became more puzzling because you're like, okay, wait a second. So he's celebrating with his guy, and then he's getting into a fracas with the referee. So it was like one of those bewildering moments where you're trying to put together exactly what happened, but. With the sense of like, oh, what did Conor McGregor do this time? Because honestly, when you see that he's in there and the pot is stirring because of him, there's always like this extra allure of like how, you're thinking of in this phase of like, what does this all mean? What does this all mean? So it was one of those slow, weird things that kind of developed. And as the details come in and you're able to process it, obviously it's like, okay, I think I got a grasp as to what happened. But it did look kind of surreal from our end. I mean, it was just kind of piecing it together as it came through.
What's the general feeling amongst, say, the journalists in the States at the moment? Because it's probably a little bit different than the journalists in Ireland. So what's the general opinion of what happened from what you can take from it?
Yeah, my sense of it is that I kind of get a sense that a lot of people thought he maybe crossed the line a little bit there, obviously, jumping that fence. And, I saw a lot of people basically defending Mark Goddard, the referee, and saying like, he was within his rights to protect that cage. That's, he's the third man in there. That's basically part of his job is to, keep the order in that situation. But I have seen, I've seen a few people kind of arguing the other way too, thinking that there might have been some blame. The way Goddard handled it, the way, other people handled it. Certainly it raises a lot of issues as to, you guys have been to UFC shows. Yeah. Right. So a lot of times when you're going to, like, as a press member, you have to go through some security. There's security guys all kind of around there. And there are UFC handlers who are kind of circulating the actual octagon who are making sure that just random people walking around are seated, that if anybody's obstructing views, that they're seated, that photographers are ducked down. It's very, very orderly. Bellator has always been a little bit different with the way they've handled it. There's a lot more obstruction. I don't think they're overly concerned, especially with a guy like Conor McGregor who's kind of maybe circulating around the cage. And because we know what kind of guy Conor is. I think that everybody he just adds a dimension to a fight, even if he's not into it. So there was just it's just a lot of weirdness. You're like, where was the security? Where were the Bellator officials? I know he kind of slapped at one of them later on and things like that, but it just, you wonder how it gets to this point. How much, of course, Conor has a sense of privilege right now, obviously, for where he's at. But it's odd to me to see events like that because you think like people share in that. They let him kind of get to a certain extent just to see what's going to happen. And that's kind of the way I looked at it. Like you're watching a guy, and out here, I think that a lot of people in the States are seeing it kind of like that. I think that I saw Dave Doyle, my colleague Dave Doyle, say something on Twitter along the lines of, this is like one of the behind the musics when you say like, we really should have noticed the first red flag at that show in Ireland, like when he did this, and you start to recollect as to those things, as if that's the beginning of the spiral type thing. We'll see if that's really the case, but it certainly has that kind of feel to it, the out of control nature of it. And it also speaks to where we're at in terms of our Conor McGregor fandom in general, that these things would just blow up to this extent, and that he's able to even be around that cage and able to jump in and able to kind of have this kind of stuff. I mean, it'll speak to the times, and it might also speak at some point to his overall, like, if he starts to fall at some point, we might look back at this as one of those catalysts. Who knows?
Like, I think that the problem with it was at the time, and according to, like, I know Mark Goddard spoke briefly about it as well, and there's a couple of different statements. Andy Ryan was, of course, talking to your colleague P.T. Carroll along with John Redmond about it. And Andy, like what you said, sort of alluded to, Bellator, in a way, they sort of have themselves to blame. They didn't have security. They were sort of letting Conor roam where he wanted to.
Essentially, for people who don't know, you had media row, you had a barrier, and then you had Conor and a lot of the other teammates just at the cage, like pretty much at the cage. So there's no barrier. Like, so when it happened, I think the problem with it was, I don't think
Bellator even teased it out, like, hey, tune in and you can check out. I mean, that tells you kind of how they were looking at it. You know what I mean?
I can say every Bellator representative I seen after this had a big smile on their face walking around. I can certainly say
I'm sure
that.
They did.
Yeah. But like,
that was a heck of a Bellator debut for Conor too, man.
Mike Goldberg's tweet was the best. I got to announce Conor's debut in Bellator.
But like, I think the issue came around though, Chuck. Where it came was confusion. Everything seemed to get confused by what happened. Goddard looked like he called the fight off, but again, the commission were saying that basically they wanted to know, was this shot that landed to put Johnny Redmond down, was this inside the round, or had the buzzer gone? So we were waiting to see. And at one stage you can see, as Mark Goddard was walking back from his quick telling Conor to get out, you can see him point to John Redmond to say, get to your corner. Yeah. So at that point, it looked like we were resetting and getting ready for round two. And that seemed to make the matter worse, because as Conor McGregor was walking back out of the cage, he sort of addressed the crowd by putting his hands up. Obviously, being in Dublin, a huge roar went up. But then you could hear him shouting, that was a stoppage, that was a stoppage. And he entered the cage again. This time it was a little bit more security stopping him. I don't think he fully got in. And then he proceeded to run around the cage and then climbed the fence, and you could see one of the staffers, I'm not sure if he was a commissioner or a staffer, was pushing Conor's leg back over, and Conor lashed out with a left. It was more of a slap than anything. Yeah. But this is where it got to the stage where this behaviour is not acceptable. And like, the thing about it is this, the Bellator 187 card, it was regulated by the Mohican Tribe Department of Athletic Regulation, and their president had spoke about it, saying basically, that Conor jeopardised the safety of John Redmond with what happened, and it was just unacceptable behaviour. End of statement. So it looks like he sort of got away with this. So from Conor's perspective, why can't he do it if he's going to get away with it?
Yeah. I mean, it looks like he's going to get away with it. That was the big, that was the big thing that was coming out of this. Obviously, we remember the Jason High incident, and there's been some incidents like this where somebody makes contact with a referee, and we've seen it in other sports certainly. And there's pretty severe, depending on where they're at in their careers or who they are. It fluctuates, but obviously, like guys like Jason High, they just cut him and they say you can't do this. Well, this is Conor McGregor, and that's not going to happen. I guess the UFC, I mean, they have a code of conduct. I don't know to what extent they carry these things out. I don't really believe they're going to suspend him or anything along those lines in terms of in-house, unless it was to serve some reason that they wanted to put a fight together that it would somehow make sense to their big picture to say, like, we can suspend, and that's the reason for this. You could see a scenario maybe in that sense, but honestly, you're taking money out of your own pocket to suspend him at any length. It just seems like, to me, it's one of those things, like the escalation of a rock star in some ways. They get a reputation as kind of being firebrands, very charismatic. Their stage performance can become a little bit more crazier as they go along. The sense of invincibility starts to take over a little bit more as they go along, and then you start to see them do things that you're like, okay, they're clearly demonstrating now that they don't believe rules, the common rules and common laws that we all are governed by, apply to them, that they're bigger than for instance, this situation, bigger than the game. What kind of bothered me more, honestly, like I'm a little bit of a, I don't mind some chaos in the fight game. I hate sanitizing it too much. You know, some of the fun elements are that it does get a little wild. It pushes it into strange boundaries within reason. And certainly Conor McGregor is very good at this. You know, like he's one of those guys. But it kind of bothers me because, you know, presumably he's jumping in there to celebrate with his teammate. And, okay, that's fine, but he's actually detracting from the teammate, taking away from that. I mean, imagine if they came back and they said, hey, the fight was going to the next round and now it's a no contest or something like that. Not only did he just jump in there and jeopardize, you know, what was his, John Redmond, you know, and all that stuff, but at the same time, then he would be affecting his own teammate's record in that sense. So there's a lot of stuff like that I'm like, I feel like it's, you know, it's just such compulsive or, you know, just him jumping in so spontaneously and like that. So, like, he needs to check himself just a little bit. You know, he needs to rein it in a little bit because that type of behavior, honestly, if you accrue it over time, you may be forgiven once or twice. But as things like this continue to happen, the public won't be as merciful as we go forward as well.
I think your point of the sense of invincibility makes sense as well, because if you look at Conor's career so far, like the first 2-weight world champion at the same time, possibly going to be the first guy to co-promote the UFC. That's a possibility. Yeah. So it's only human nature for guys to get that sense of invincibility. But what do you think would be a sensible punishment for Conor? For me, I think a suspension of 6 months to a year makes sense, but I don't think it's going to happen. What do you think is a sensible punishment?
I don't know, man. It's such a strange, like, every single thing we deal with, I feel like every time I dissect the Conor McGregor fight or, you know, his predictions or anything that we're dealing with Conor McGregor, it's all sort of unprecedented because nobody within the UFC has meant as much, and especially within a new era of the new ownership and everything else. So you're just not sure what would be appropriate in this situation. He's already had the incident where you know, he was flinging the bottles at Nate Diaz and everything like that, and you know, we saw kind of how that played out. It was ultimately just a slap on the wrist. At some point, you know, they're gonna have to level some kind of something that will actually send a message to him, and maybe, I don't know. I mean, he just came off of this really ridiculous payday. I don't know how much a fine. I don't know how much you have to fine him. I don't even know like what affect him on that level. We know he likes his money, but maybe what are they going to do? I don't know how much you can actually fine him for that. A suspension might be the way to speak to him, but again, I feel like this is a weird one because I feel like then this thing could get skewed as to why he's not fighting so and so and so and so. You know what I mean? It could just open up a can of worms that then changes so much else and makes it a dark look for the UFC. So it'd be interesting to see what they end up doing, but honestly, man, I'm glad I'm not the one who has to figure this thing out. You know what I mean?
When I was sitting watching it, I couldn't believe it when it was happening in front of us. I was like, going, "Is this happening?"
I wish I was there. That would have been to get the full context of what was going on. That would have been better to be there, rather than get it piecemeal like I was getting it. You know what I mean?
It was like for me, it's, you know, the whole, you're looking at a car crash, but you just can't take your eyes off it, even though you don't want to watch it. That's what for me. I was looking at going, am I watching this? But for me, where it really homed home for me was the next day when, you know, the videos were out and there was great photography taken of it. And like, to hone it in, as much as we're talking about it's bad for the UFC and stuff like that, MMA here in Ireland, Chuck, is very, you know, we've been building it, and there's a lot of great work, including Conor's head coach, John Kavanagh, Andy Ryan, who it was his fighter, John Redmond fighting. But there's a lot of great people building the reputation of MMA here in Ireland, and we're really pushing to get the sport seen and recognised as legitimate, and just to be recognised by the government and a government body here, and to be, you know, seen as a real sport. So the man who has done the most for MMA, you could argue worldwide, but also the man who has like literally set Ireland on fire for mixed martial arts. It was like a house of cards. You could just see that crumbling. And for me, the one thing I thought looking at these pictures was this was not a good look for Irish MMA. And that's what, for me, hit me the hardest with it. A lot of people have sort of talked about, you know, this man is a role model, you know, to his kids at this event. I'm not too sure, like, as in, I felt for that a little bit. We were talking to young guys going in. It was a young kid on his birthday was going in, and he was telling us how big a Conor McGregor fan he is and stuff. Yes, fighters are fighters, so they become role models, but they don't necessarily start off as role models. They are a fighter at the end of the day. It is a hard game where you have to be the alpha male. So that argument is a little. But my thing was Irish MMA has worked so hard, and the biggest superstar in it really blackened its eye on Friday night, and that's what I took from it, and was a little disappointed in it. And I think something has to be done. Just calm down, man, and do what you're doing.
Relax,
you're a born entertainer. You're the modern day Muhammad Ali in MMA or what you do, and stick to that. It doesn't need to be controversy. And I don't know if it was just. I can appreciate what was happening with Charlie Ward is a good friend of Conor McGregor, not just a teammate. Yeah. He's also, I believe, works as a bodyguard for Conor. So they're two very close gentlemen. So I think his sentiment of celebration was a good original sentiment. Yeah, it just went. And then it just went crazy.
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't have even been worried. Ultimately, I think there would have been a little bit of discussion about him jumping in the cage, given the timing and how aggressive he kind of jumped in there and did that. But let's just say that that's where it ended. There was, guard had said, get out. He's kind of like, oh, sorry, guys, I just lost my mind for a minute, and he got back out. I don't really think you would just be talking about how exuberant he is for his teammates. And ultimately, there may still be some discussion about is that appropriate. But it comes down to almost an obnoxiousness at this point, because when it gets, we just went through this whole ordeal with the Mayweather fight, and there was a lot of scrutiny on this fight, a lot that was that skews into the funhouse aspect of fighting, which I didn't really like, but it was it certainly opened your mind to a lot of different things in terms of boxers in the boxing realm, meeting with the MMA realm. It was fun, and I keep seeing him as this guy who's pushing things into new, just kind of broadening everything, broadening the UFC, broadening his own brand, if you want to call it, but broadening how we look at fighters, how the casual world looks at fighters. He's one of those guys who actually makes you do that. So I agree with you 100%, man. Not just from an Irish standpoint of what he's been able to do for the country and mixed martial arts in that country and to take it to those, but just all over. I mean, this is a guy who at this point has, every tweet he does it just blows up and goes viral. You know what I mean? It's like he has those kind of eyes that can balloon the other way and go and turn negative very fast and turn a lot of people off very fast if these kinds of shenanigans go on. And honestly, man, as a guy who covers the sport, you don't want to see it. You don't want to see him. You don't want to see him spiral out of control, where we're talking about him in some weird way anytime soon. Because honestly, man, the guy, there's so much more that he can offer the sport than that. You know what I mean?
Speaking of tweets, he did tweet today. As we seen, the tweet I seen was this tweet barely stayed up longer than Jose Aldo at UFC 91-94. But the tweet was bloke KO'd on the floor about a minute straight, and ref trying to say fight's not over, Conor. That's when I lost it. Fuck yous all.
And then deleted it.
It was deleted. So that was right. That was the tweet.
That was today.
It was up for about a minute this morning.
There's some John Jones in it.
No remorse. No remorse.
So again, it's something I'm sure it's not going to be the last we hear about this.
We'll see what happens.
I just think it was a bad look for MMA in general.
And I don't want to open any can of worms, but you hope that kind of erratic behavior is just exuberance and not something else, man. That's what I hear. All little whispers are like, I hope he's not, over partying and getting a little bit too crazy within his own personal life. You know what I'm saying? Because you see that kind of behavior, it certainly raises red flags.
Absolutely.
And I think it's going to be. I think people are starting to watch him in different ways now. So I hope he, like I said, man, I hope he starts to check himself just a little bit in those situations.
What I found about it, I fully agree with you. What I found about it is a lot of my people that I know who aren't mixed martial arts fans actually were messaging me to say, oh, what about your boy now? Are you not talking about him now? So it's almost like people are waiting for the great. And that's in every country. When somebody falls, there'll always be someone to kick you when you're there. But I think people, as you said, people are sort of looking at that going, here's your boy, starting to go. But let's... Is
the Irish media coming down on him pretty hard, or are they seeing it more on his side?
No, I have to say, I felt like we were there with the likes of the Irish journalists, MMA journalists that were covering it, the likes of Severe, Talking Brawls.
Petey was there.
Petey Carroll was there. Everybody was unified that this was unacceptable and the line was crossed.
Good. I mean, that's the general sense over here. So I mean, it just sounds like everybody's got a pretty balanced idea of what they're looking at here.
Yeah.
Let's move
Let's
it
get
on to
off
the next
Conor
piece.
McGregor.
Let's get off Conor McGregor. And let's move to Jesus, we've got disappointing news coming. We were spoiled with UFC 217. The gods aligned and we thought, yep, this is magic. But Anderson Silva fails another drug test, and Michael Bisping has stepped in to fight Kelvin Gastelum in Shanghai. But before we address Michael Bisping, Anderson Silva, what's your thoughts when you seen this news, Chuck?
My thought was, man, so first of all, at 42 years old, Anderson Silva clearly in his twilight, and to be completely honest, I'd rather he wasn't fighting anyway. But just to go through a legacy, there's so many years where you're considered the best guy, pound for pound, and in mixed martial arts history, and to have this kind of end. Just that's my first thought was like, man, again, since he just went through this whole USADA thing from the Nick Diaz fight. Yeah. So that was my first thing. Was just I was thinking of his overall legacy right off the bat, and then it was just kind of par for the course because, like you guys just mentioned, we came off that great. I actually just wrote a column about this. We come off this great weekend. I feel like this is always the tax we pay for having a very big weekend. Madison Square Garden, and this like. The week just kind of blows up, and this just was like one more piece of news that was like, oh my God, what else can possibly happen? And given the Dominic Cruz, the couple of fights that were really good, Dominic Cruz falling out of his fight again, coming up in that one, and then what was the other one? Somebody else.
Edgar.
No, the whole Jose Aldo, that whole. So to me, it was just like it was kind of retribution from the MMA gods once again smiting us with getting too happy about our sport. But honestly, man, like in all seriousness, just a sad ending to Anderson Silva's career. I mean, you already had to put an asterisk a little bit on his career because you weren't sure how far some of, obviously these guys who fought in Pride and fought in Japan and then early UFC, you never knew to what extent they're doing it. And this certainly is not the look he wants because I think now this is asterisk turns to bold. You know what I mean? Now we have to really look at how much this tarnishes his legacy.
What stands out with the comments you said there about lads coming after Pride and not doing well, Phil Baroni was talking with Ariel actually, and he turned around and he said the problem wasn't the guys were coming off the juice in coming from Pride. The problem was the guys in the UFC were on better juice than the guys coming off the juice in Pride.
I believe that too. I believe that.
But for me, like. I was weird with Anderson. I flip-flopped with Anderson. I loved him. I remember watching Anderson Silva fight on the UK circuit. And then when he signed for the UFC, he then, when he beat, I was a big Rich Franklin fan. So when he beat Rich Franklin, he was the enemy to me. I was cheering for Franklin. And then when he went on his run, I was like, oh my God, this guy is incredible. But then he started clowning. And I was then wanting to see him get beat because he was so good. So I flip-flopped a couple of times with Anderson Silva. But it really does. It throws shade over his whole career, and that's a sad ending.
You'd wonder what his legacy will look like now because it's sometimes unfortunate when guys get popped that you look back, how long has he been taking it? It's unfortunate, but it's always going to be that way. Once you get caught, everyone's going to think that way. So how do you think it's going to affect his legacy? Do you think people are not going to really talk about him as the best of all time anymore?
You know what's really crazy about it is just the timing, like we were just talking about, because GSP comes back after 4 years, wins a middleweight title, and then you go through this scenario of it kind of revs up in a real way the pound for pound conversation again, which is not the greatest conversation because it's very subjective and everything else. But I think that most people would say like, John Jones, huge asterisk all over his name now, but he's still there, depending sort of too on what happens with him in the next little bit of time here, what happens in his latest incident. But you had GSP kind of shooting back up now under a different context of winning that title, so he's there, and you had Anderson Silva, and it's such a complicated thing now to actually discuss, because I feel like to have proper context, you have to then drag, whoever you're talking to, you have to go through the mud with them, and it's just not a pleasant conversation to have. But I think that Anderson Silva, I would like to say that we would look back on his career and just be like, wow, man, there was just not. He was the greatest for his time, and maybe in the late part, he started trying to make himself younger and was doing some stuff to do this stuff. But I honestly believe the way this fight game moves and how it and just the way it goes, I don't know if we're going to look at him like that. I think it's going to hurt him in the end because it'll be the last look, first of all, and I think it really does cast a shadow backwards over his career, and that's the unfortunate thing, man. Because I'm with you, man. Like I watched him. He was a little bit polarizing at times. There were some fights where you did want to see him get beat just because he was clowning on guys, and there was times where he'd drive me crazy when they would talk to him about fighting his clone and kind of not ducking guys, but he would, not giving the time of day to certain challengers, things like that. But ultimately, when he was in there, I mean, like that Forrest Griffin fight will remain one of my favorites of all time, just the way he bewitched him in there and with his movement and everything like that. But I think that this will shroud the whole thing ultimately. Just depending on what it is, I don't want to falsely obviously it doesn't look good at this moment. But if this stands and this is the last we hear of Anderson Silva, that's not going to reflect well on his career.
What about? Just I know we're going to jump in. What about Bisping taking this 3 weeks after
after losing the title? After as well, when you think about it, he spoke about possibly retiring after GSP, and then he said, "Oh, maybe I won't retire. I want to fight again in England." And then he takes a fight in
Shanghai.
What's?
But my fear is Bisping.
And he didn't want to fight. He didn't want to fight Whitaker because he didn't want to go back to Australia. He didn't want to make the big trip and all this. I mean, out of all the names they pulled out of the hat, or they could have pulled out of the hat, I wouldn't have foreseen that coming.
What do you think of it though, from a medical point standpoint, like as in?
Yeah.
The fact he got choked out and took some heavy shots against GSP, like he got dropped against GSP. Yeah. So here we are coming in against Kelvin Gastelum. From that standpoint, I think it's maybe a little poor on the promotions end that they're. Yeah. I'm not. He obviously has to get cleared, but
he always, you know how it is, man. They always kind of deflect responsibility to. Well, it's a 3-month suspension or a doctor saying it's okay because he's declared by a doctor. And I guess this is one of those things they're calling in. Well, the doctor said he's okay, so we're gonna And to me, I'm like, man, it's not just that he got rocked in that fight, right, or choked out, and he was bleeding, and you just see this happening before your eyes, and it just happened, literally just happened. Yeah. It's also just the cumulative toll we've seen on this guy. I mean, like, he has taken some punishment. Honestly, there's not. He's unparalleled in terms of heart and chin, as far as I'm concerned, for a legacy. For the amount of wins he has, because he's the winningest guy, right? Tied now with GSP, but the winningest fighter out there, and all this stuff. But he's taking so much punishment, and to go on against Gastelum on short notice, and Gastelum proving him to be, he's like an oak tree, man, at this weight still. And I feel like just watching what he did with I'm talking about Gastelum, watching what he did with like Tim Kennedy and things like that. It just seems very like, I don't know about that. You can't question Bisping's heart or want or his willingness or just being a company guy and like that. But man, I'm not sure I want to see it, to be honest with you. But to me, it's just because I had never thought of it, and just given all that context I just filled in, I'm not sure I loved it. But at the same time, you can't help but admire him for wanting to do it. You know what I mean? I mean, to me, that guy, like, he deserves kudos every time he does something like this. You're like, unbelievable. That's Michael Bisping.
I think that Bisping, I don't think he was too happy with his performance against GSP in some way.
He said he wanted to go back.
Yeah, he wanted to get. So you can understand it from that perspective, but I was just surprised.
It's not a favourable matchup anyway.
When I seen the tweet with the poster, I just thought somebody, used Photoshop, and I'm like, yeah, get out of here. But yeah, crazy fight. Briefly, we touch on a couple of fights quickly. What do you think of the Holloway and Jose Aldo getting the rematch? Again, this is another fight I saw. I went,
weird,
yeah.
So this is one of those ones where Frankie Edgar, so I think besides when he was the champion, I feel like he lives behind the 8 ball, right? Like, so every time something happens to him, it's not a one-tiered bad thing that happens. It's always two-pronged. And this one is like the situation where they throw Aldo into, to fill in for him. And you're like, this is crazy, because let's just say that Aldo wins.
Yeah.
Frankie Edgar is nowhere near a title shot again, because nobody's going to want to see that fight. So I always look at it like, well, how does that change the stakes? And for a guy like Frankie Edgar, you can't. I mean, that's about as bad as it gets. To fall out of your own and then maybe not be able to get back to that shot, which he's been through before. So I thought about that a lot, just from the Frankie Edgar standpoint. From the actual. There's a little bit of intrigue, I guess, in the sense that Max Holloway, I will say that I thought he worked over, Aldo so big the first time that I wasn't pining for that rematch. I thought a guy like Cub Swanson, obviously, who's been coming up, would be the fresh blood to kind of go in there and and get that shot because he's one. I think that the fan sentiment seemed to be on that side, and he seemed to want it. I was looking at just his Twitter and stuff like that. It seemed like he was more than willing to get in there and do it. So I was a little surprised that they went the Aldo route, especially given just some of the rocky terrain they went through with Aldo through the last couple of years. Just, you know, he's not had a great relationship with the UFC, so who knows what's going on behind the scenes. But I was a little surprised, I guess a little disappointed, man. I would have liked to have seen. I was pretty convinced in my own guesswork that it was going to be Cub Swanson stepping in there.
Yeah, that's the fight I was going for.
I would have went Cub Swanson. It's like the most unlikely immediate rematch ever. This one, like, because
I know it is
the most unlikely.
It is.
The other piece of news I want to touch on before we let you go is Bellator heavyweight tournament coming up. Scott Coker doing the heavyweight tournament again, this time in Bellator, not Strikeforce. What do you think of that?
Yeah. It's so the first time they did it, I like the idea, but it's so hard to execute, right? That's why Daniel Cormier ends up winning it, and it's just people like it never. You're looking at a best laid plan whenever they do this. Oh, this is if everything goes perfect, this is what you're looking at. It never goes perfect in these things. So what you're seeing, this iteration of what we're seeing is just a rough draft of what it'll end up being. And I think that that's always the one thing that if you go into it with that, like this will be altered, probably some people that we're not even talking about will then enter the tournament, and who knows how this will all play out. I think that's the realistic way to view it. But taken for granted that it comes out close, I guess, to what it's supposed to. Like the 8 guys they've talked about are all in it. It's a lot of fun, given that some of those guys are talkers. Some of them have never been heavyweights. Yeah. Some of them are, kind of past their prime guys that you're a little bit like Fedor or Emelianenko. Yeah, it's always fun to contemplate them, but you're like, really? 3 fights through? I mean, it's hard to even fathom. Frank Mir, who hasn't been. I mean, so it's almost like that. I hate to use the word the circus tent thing, but it's like to me it kind of fully embraces that, because you have guys who are just coming up that make for the fun thing always is when you've never contemplated someone's like Chael Sonnen fighting Fedor. You've never thought about Chael fighting Frank Mir. I mean, to me these things are like they kind of blow your mind. So I could see it being a lot of fun on that, and especially if somebody like Rory McDonald somehow weasels his way in there too, then it becomes a whole different thing too. But I'm going to try that.
Nope, just lost connection.
Lost connection. Let's hope he comes back.
Hope he comes back. It'll be a hang up and call back.
Yeah.
Definitely hang up and call back.
So if the tournament plays out ultimately as they envision it, it could be a lot of fun. But we know how hard it is just to get 2 guys to make it to the octagon or get into a fight anyway. So for the whole thing to come off, I'm going to be a little skeptical, but I appreciate the innovation and thought in this whole thing.
I do, but my query about it is why have they called it a heavyweight competition and not just an open weight competition? We got 4 heavyweights, 3 light heavyweights, a middleweight, and a welterweight trying to get into it.
Exactly right. That's what they should have called it. You're right. I guess it's just because they wanted to make
a heavyweight title.
Make sure everybody was above a certain weight, because that seems to be the contention, right? Everybody making 206 pounds.
Yeah. It's a weird one.
No, it's definitely it's weird, but we are.
I'm excited. Absolutely.
And your colleague your colleague Ariel has also said that sources close to him say that Bellator are working on Fedor versus Frank Mir to be in the first
dream
round.
Match a couple of years ago, but still.
The former UFC heavyweight against this was the whole who's the best heavyweight in the world moment. So good fight, I think, to probably open it if it is that way.
Yeah, I'm all about that, man. And honestly, when you look back at the Strikeforce tournament, it was pretty fun.
It was great. I loved it. I loved it.
It fizzled because Strikeforce was fizzling. The whole thing was ending. But as it was the first round, I remember that being a lot of fun. So you got to kind of hope that this one, because they're on more solid ground, obviously with Bellator and everything that's going on, maybe they can get behind it, promote it the right way, and make it that way. You know what I mean? But that would be a fun first fight.
I'm gonna say a catchphrase, because it's not true when I say it though. But I will literally say, take my money. But we don't get it live here, so we will be illegally streaming it, so they won't be getting any money. But if I could give them money, I would say take my money. I'm interested. Yeah. It's got me. It's old guys. It's guys who aren't in the weight class. It's weird. It's like one of the best fighters on the planet who's just deciding, the hell with it, all fighting. And so
that's how it feels. It feels like Scott Coker and his guys are in a room and they're like, "What if we just did this?" And that's how it feels. But I don't mind at all, man. I mean, when you're trying to distinguish yourself, And a lot of those guys, you're not sure what to do with them. Why not make it an 8-man thing? So it's an 8-man split interest. You know what I mean? Like, who wins this thing? So in my mind, it's like, as long as it comes across like it's supposed to, and think all the fights kind of happen the way they're supposed to, perfect for them at this moment.
Oh, you really do.
Yeah.
For a week of MMA that we've had, what a week it's been. What a week of news. And I wouldn't mind, we've left so many things out as well, but some week, and it was great to recap it with you, Chuck, and get your opinions and thoughts on it. Shout out again to, if people aren't following you, I don't know why if they're into MMA, but if people aren't following you, where can they find you on Twitter and stuff?
Just my name, Chuck Mindenhall. Pretty irreverent on there, so you're not going to find any breaking news, but I'll make you laugh a little bit.
Excellent, man. Listen, Cheers. It's an absolute pleasure chatting MMA with you again, and we'll do it again in the future. But keep up the great work, and we'll talk soon.
All right, guys. Take care.
Cheers,
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye. There you go, Chuck Mindenhall.